The room went quiet in a way it had never gone quiet before, and it happened in the space of about 4 seconds. Tuesday night at Iron Harbor in Providence belonged to Brant Kessler, 27 years old, black belt, 3-time regional champion, the kind of man who'd hold a 19-year-old beginner down 3 seconds longer than he had to, and then stand up without offering a hand. At 10 minutes to 9, the door opened and a man rolled in. He was somewhere in his 30s, dress shirt, sleeves folded back, no expression on his face at all. Across his lap lay a folded belt, so old it had faded from black to the color of ash. He didn't look at anybody. He just wheeled himself to the edge of the mat and started taking off his watch. Brant looked at the chair for a long moment. Then he crossed the mat slowly, the way a man crosses a room when he already knows every eye is on him, leaned down with a grin like he was doing the guy a favor, took a fistful of his collar and twisted it, and told him the rehab center was 2 blocks up the road. Somebody laughed. It didn't last, because the man in the chair didn't pull away, didn't flinch, didn't say a word. He looked down at the fist holding his collar. He looked back up, and then he smiled. If you're here for stories about dignity and about people who get underestimated, hit that like button so more folks can find this one. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe, because there's plenty more where this came from. Now let's go back to Iron Harbor, to that Tuesday night, and to the 15 minutes nobody in that room would ever forget. That smile unsettled Brant more than a punch ever could. He twisted his fist another turn, pulling the fabric of the shirt tighter around the neck of the man in the wheelchair, and waited for the reaction he had grown accustomed to through all the years he had stood on this mat. That moment when people either flushed red and argued back, or lowered their eyes and apologized. But nothing happened. The man remained still, his hands resting lightly on the rims of the wheels, and Brant happened to glance down at them. The knuckles were thick and rough in a way no gym in the world could ever produce. Then the man spoke. His voice was very quiet, quiet enough for the ceiling fan to drown it out, quiet enough that Brant had to lean even lower to hear him clearly. And the instant he bent down, he realized that he was the one who had bowed his head first, while the other man hadn't moved so much as an inch. No one else in the room heard what he said. Wes Croft, the 19-year-old student who was still sitting on the edge of the mat rubbing his jaw, saw only the man's lips move for a few brief sounds. Hollis Mackey, standing behind the counter, didn't hear it either. But every one of them saw what happened next. Brant Kessler's hand opened. The fistful of fabric slipped from his fingers as though he had chosen to let go, and he stepped back once, then another half step, his heels dragging across the mat with a short squeal in the silent room. Later, lying in bed at 3 o'clock in the morning with his eyes fixed on the ceiling, he still couldn't explain to himself why he had released him. The other man hadn't threatened him. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't mentioned a single name. There was simply something in the way he spoke, the manner of a man who had said similar things in other rooms, to other people, and had never once needed to say them a second time. Brant stood there with his face burning, and he did what men like him always did when they felt the ground beneath their feet shift. He turned his back. He turned away from the wheelchair, spread his arms wide toward the entire class, and laughed loudly, the kind of laugh deliberately meant to fill the room. He said that was enough. Everyone should get back to practice. They had a distinguished guest tonight, and he spoke the words distinguished guest in a tone that made it clear to everyone that he was trying to reclaim something that had just slipped from his grasp. A few people laughed along, but this time the laughter was thin and scattered, sounding more like something offered out of politeness than genuine amusement. The man in the wheelchair didn't look after him at all. He had already returned to what he had been doing, removing his watch, folding it closed, placing it in his palm, then picking up the belt draped across his lap and beginning to smooth it straight. The belt had faded so badly that it was no longer black, but had turned the color of ash, the color of something that had rested in a man's hands longer than most of the people in that room had been alive. Behind the counter, Hollis Mackey stood perfectly still. He had built this gym with his own 2 hands, back when no one had even bothered to open a business in this neighborhood. He had seen every kind of person imaginable walk through those glass doors, and he knew exactly who he was looking at. He remembered an afternoon from a very long time ago, when a driver had walked in, said very little, and simply placed a thick envelope on the counter, paying a full year in advance to rent the floor at 11 o'clock at night, when no one remained in the building except Hollis and the dehumidifier. He hadn't asked why. When people paid in cash, he accepted cash. But now, standing behind the counter with the cleaning cloth still in his hand, Hollis looked toward Brant Kessler, who was speaking loudly in the middle of the mat, then toward the man quietly smoothing his ash-colored belt, and he felt something cold travel down his spine. He knew he should step out from behind the counter. He knew he should say something. But he remained exactly where he was, and he said nothing at all. It could have ended there. The whole room had returned to practice, the sounds of labored breathing and bodies striking the mat rising once again, and if Brant Kessler had been willing to leave it alone, that evening would have passed like any other Tuesday night. But there was one thing he couldn't swallow, and that was the feeling that everyone in the room had just watched him let go. He circled the edge of the mat once, then twice, and with every lap he glanced toward the wheelchair again. The man was still sitting there, the ash-colored belt now wrapped around his waist, his hands resting on his thighs, utterly unconcerned that he was being watched. It was that very indifference that drove Brant mad. He stopped, turned fully toward the corner of the room, and this time there was no trace of mockery in his voice. He said that some people walked into this place to train, while others walked in so everyone else would feel sorry for them. He said people paid to be thrown onto the mat in this gym, not to be patted on the shoulder and comforted. Then he added one more sentence, something about sitting and standing, something no one in the room would ever want to repeat afterward, and the instant those words left his mouth, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. The sound of labored breathing stopped. Wes Croft lowered his head and stared at his bare feet. Two young men wearing blue belts in the far corner laughed as they turned away. The kind of laughter that came from people who knew something was wrong but didn't want to be the first to say so. Hollis Mackey dropped the cleaning cloth onto the counter and opened his mouth. But before he could make a sound, someone else spoke first. In the hallway leading to the locker rooms, Tessa Marlowe propped her mop against the wall. She did it very slowly, carefully resting the wooden handle against the edge of the wall so it wouldn't fall, then removing her rubber gloves, folding them, and placing them across the rim of the bucket before stepping out onto the mat. She was 27 years old, dressed in a cleaner's smock, with a name embroidered over the left side of her chest in fraying thread, her hair tied back in haste, and no one in that room had ever paid attention to whether she was there or not. People walked across the places she had just cleaned without looking down. They left empty water bottles on the steps, knowing with certainty that someone would clear them away by morning. She was something that had always simply been there, like the dehumidifier in the corner, or the stain on the ceiling, and that was precisely why everyone looked up when she stepped into the middle of the floor. Her hands were trembling. Anyone standing close enough could see it. Could see her fingers clasped tightly together in front of her stomach to keep them from shaking even more. But when she spoke, there wasn't the slightest tremor in her voice. She told Brant Kessler that the man had paid to be in that room just as he had, and that the only thing Brant had managed to prove that night was that he wasn't decent enough to keep his mouth shut. When she finished, she remained exactly where she was. A silence lasting precisely 2 breaths followed, and then the entire room burst into laughter. It wasn't loud, wholehearted laughter, but the kind that broke free out of relief. Laughter because someone had finally done something amusing enough to shatter the suffocating tension that had filled the room moments before. Someone whistled. A voice from the back of the room called out that it was time for the cleaning lady to end her shift. Brant Kessler turned fully toward her, laughing louder than anyone else. He laughed and asked what she intended to do, whether she planned to mop the floor with him, then added that people in this place only listened to those who knew how to stand on the mat. Tessa didn't answer. She didn't step back either. She remained exactly where she had stopped, her hands clasped tightly together, her chin raised slightly, and she looked straight into his eyes until he was the one who had to look away first. She knew perfectly well what she had just done. She knew Hollis Mackey was standing behind that counter, and Hollis was the man who signed her paychecks. She knew this nighttime cleaning job was the last thing keeping her on this side of a very thin line, and she had just risked it for a single sentence spoken in defense of a man she had never met, a man who hadn't even looked in her direction. But there are nights when a person simply can't remain silent any longer, and this was one of those nights. At the edge of the mat, the man in the wheelchair slowly raised his head, and for the first time since passing through those glass doors, he looked directly at someone. He looked at her a little longer than necessary, then said, "Thank you." Just those 2 words, spoken loudly enough for the entire room to hear, and something in the way he said them made the laughter from moments before suddenly sound strangely cheap. Then he turned his wheelchair to face Brant Kessler and told him that if he wanted to prove something, the mat was right there, and there was no need to prove it with his mouth. Brant blinked. Everyone in the room waited for him to burst out laughing, But he didn't. He asked if the man truly wanted to get on the mat, and the man replied that he had been sitting there for nearly an hour, and he hadn't come there to sit. Then he set the rules himself, and what he proposed made the people standing nearby glance at one another. He said he would remain on the mat for the entire match, that he wouldn't stand, wouldn't use his legs for support, and wouldn't use any position that required both legs. He said Brant could close in from any direction and use the full weight of his body, and that the match would end only when one of them tapped the mat to submit. He said all of this in the calm voice of a man reading through a grocery list, and when Brant Kessler heard it, he genuinely laughed, a short laugh filled with relief, because he was certain he had just won this negotiation. Hollis Mackey came around from behind the counter. He said loudly that it wasn't going to happen, not in his gym, that he wouldn't allow anyone onto the mat when he knew for certain it would end with a call for an ambulance, and his voice trembled with what only he knew to be fear. The man in the wheelchair didn't argue with him at all. He didn't raise his voice, mention honor, or invoke his rights as a customer. He simply asked Hollis whether he remembered the envelope from October of the previous year, the one containing advance payment for an entire year of late-night floor rentals, then asked whether they needed to sit down together and review the contract, because he still had a copy. Hollis Mackey froze in the middle of the floor. He remembered the envelope. He also remembered the very thing he had been trying not to think about all evening, that when he had renewed the lease for this building the previous year, he had seen the name Marchetti on the paperwork. He couldn't say another word. He took a step back, raised a hand to scratch his neck, then turned toward the counter and pretended to search for something in a drawer. Beyond the glass doors, beneath the yellow lights of the parking lot, a broad-shouldered man in a dark coat stood with his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes fixed on the room inside. His name was Bruno Sacco, and he had been standing there from the moment the wheelchair crossed the threshold. He didn't enter. It wasn't because the door was locked, but because the man inside had laid down a rule many years earlier that none of them was ever to set foot on this mat, no matter what happened. Bruno had challenged that rule exactly once, in the beginning, and he never challenged it a second time. Inside, the man removed his watch and gave it to Hollis for safekeeping. Then he locked both wheels, placed his hands on the sides of the chair, lowered his center of gravity, and transferred his entire body onto the mat in one fluid motion. There was no impact, no unsteadiness. The movement was so clean and practiced that it passed before their eyes faster than they could summon their pity, and that was precisely what sent a chill down the spines of several people in the room. He settled in the middle of the mat, adjusted his ash-colored belt, and looked up to wait. Brant Kessler approached, towering over him, bent down, and extended his fist according to custom. The man touched his fist to Brant's, and in the hallway, Tessa Marlowe remained exactly where she had been, her hands clasped tightly together, without the slightest thought of returning for her mop. Brant Kessler didn't wait another second. He lunged the instant their fists separated, driving the full weight of his upper body downward, both hands spread wide to seize the shoulders and collar of the man seated beneath him, the kind of attack used by someone so accustomed to ending everything simply by crushing his opponent to the mat. Everyone watching thought they were about to have to look away, but the man on the mat didn't resist the force. He shifted his hips by the span of a hand, placed one shin across Brant's path, pressed his palm against Brant's elbow, and turned his body in the exact direction Brant was already charging. Suddenly, all the force Brant had driven downward had nowhere to land. He slid over the man's shoulder, lost his bearings in the air for half a heartbeat, then crashed onto the mat on the other side. The fall wasn't very loud, but afterward, the entire room was silent. No one laughed. No one whistled. The two young men wearing blue belts in the far corner had risen to their feet without even realizing it. Wes Croft sat upright, his lips parted. Hollis Mackey stood behind the counter with the watch still resting in his palm, having forgotten he was even holding it. Brant sprang up so quickly it was almost a convulsion. His face was burning red, not from exertion, but from something else. He wiped his hands on his pant legs and loudly said that the mat was slippery in that corner, that he had rushed his attack, and that anyone who had trained long enough had experienced that once or twice. No one answered him. The man on the mat said nothing either. He merely adjusted his ash-colored belt, straightened his back, and waited. The second time, Brant approached more slowly. He didn't charge. He advanced one step at a time, lowering his body and extending both hands to test the distance, before catching hold of his opponent's collar and sleeve. This was what he was good at. He tightened both fists, bore down, then jerked hard, the kind of pull meant to break a man's balance, forcing him to strain in resistance until he exhausted himself. It had always worked on everyone else, but this time, Brant felt as though he were pulling on a heavy curtain. There was something at the other end, but it didn't resist him. It simply didn't follow. He pulled to the right, and the other man flowed with the motion before stopping precisely where he needed to stop. Brant drove downward, and the other man yielded before returning to position. It continued that way for several beats, and sweat began running down Brant's temples. He started breathing through his mouth in short, rapid gasps. Then he felt the other man's hand settle over his wrist. It wasn't fast or forceful. The hand merely came to rest there. But the instant those fingers closed, Brant understood that the wrist was no longer his. It wasn't the crushing grip of someone who lifted weights. It was thick, it was heavy, and it came from somewhere very deep, the kind of hand that could only be formed after decades spent gripping the fabric of other men's clothing. Brant jerked his arm back violently. It didn't move. He tightened his entire back and pulled again, and at that exact moment, the other hand released him. Because Brant had been using all his strength to pull backward, the sudden release sent him falling onto his back, and he had to plant a hand on the mat to catch himself. In the brief moment while he was still struggling to brace his body, the man slid inside, threaded one arm beneath Brant's armpit, trapped his shoulder, and rotated his body until all his weight settled on a single point on Brant's chest. Brant lay flat on his back. He still had both legs, all his strength, and the imposing build everyone in the room had always respected, but he couldn't lift the man pinning him down. He kicked his legs, twisted his hips, and pushed against the other man's shoulder with both hands. But every time he applied force, that weight shifted with him. It never resisted. It simply remained exactly where it needed to be to ensure he couldn't go anywhere. Then something happened that the people in the room would continue talking about for a long time afterward. The man relaxed his arm. He loosened the hold on Brant's shoulder by the smallest degree, just enough for Brant Kessler to find an opening, turn over, plant his knees beneath him, and crawl free. Brant retreated, dropped heavily into a seated position, and gasped for air. For an instant, the thought crossed his mind that he had escaped on his own, but that thought lasted less than a single breath, because when he looked up, he saw the other man still sitting in the same place, his breathing steady, his hands resting on his knees, quietly waiting for Brant to return. And the entire room understood at the same moment he did that the man hadn't truly fought him at all. There is a humiliation heavier than defeat, and that night, Brant Kessler learned its name. That realization was what pushed Brant Kessler beyond the line. He got to his feet, and everyone in the room could see that he was no longer training. He didn't lower his stance, didn't extend a hand to test the distance, didn't do any of the things a black belt had been taught to do. He charged straight in with his full shoulder, both hands driving violently forward, a shove that belonged outside every rule governing this room, the kind of shove a man used only when he no longer wanted to win and wanted only to cause pain. Hollis Mackey shouted from beside the counter. But the man on the mat had already acted before the shout reached him. He didn't move aside. Moving aside would have given Brant the space to gather momentum and come at him again. He met the shove by raising both forearms across his body, drawing his knees together to form a frame, and the full weight of Brant Kessler crashed into that frame and died there, like a wave breaking against the pilings of a pier. Brant stopped dead. His breath deserted him. His eyes opened wide, and both hands remained outstretched before him as though he had no idea what to do next. The man was still breathing evenly, keeping the same rhythm he'd maintained from the moment he came through the glass door, without so much as a single breath coming faster. From that moment on, everything unfolded with a slowness that felt almost cruel. He hooked one leg over Brant's thigh to hold him in place, turned his hips through the smallest angle, and Brant toppled sideways onto the mat like a door whose hinges had been removed. The man didn't hurry. He secured each element one at a time, one arm slipping into position, one hand taking hold of the collar behind Brant's neck, the other gripping the opposite lapel, all of them basic movements whose names anyone who had trained for a few months would know, except that every movement was placed in exactly the right position, at exactly the right moment, without a single detail overlooked. Brant Kessler knew precisely what was happening. That was what made it so terrifying. He knew he had to thread a hand inside to break the hold. He knew which way he needed to turn his chin, and he had taught this exact technique to his students the previous Thursday night. But his arms were pinned tightly against his chest by the weight of the man's body, and every time he exhaled, the small amount of space left around his neck narrowed a little more, and never opened again. The man tightened the hold slowly. There was no wrenching motion, no sudden burst of force, only the gradual lowering of both elbows toward the surface of the mat, little by little, until Brant could hear his own blood pounding in his ears. The room was so quiet that the hum of the dehumidifier in the corner could be clearly heard. Wes Croft rose to his feet, one hand braced against the wall. Tessa Marlowe couldn't take her eyes off the mat. Brant struggled one final time, both heels kicking against the mat, and then he understood that this could end in no other way. He raised his right hand. It was trembling. He brought it down and tapped the mat twice, and in that silent room, those 2 taps sounded as loud as a knock on the door at midnight. The man released him immediately. He didn't hold on for another moment to prove anything, didn't keep the pressure for even half a second longer to teach anyone a lesson. His hands left Brant's collar the instant the second tap ended, and he shifted his body backward, planted one hand on the mat, sat upright, and waited for Brant to breathe again. Brant lay flat on his back, his chest rising and falling, one arm draped across his eyes. No one came closer. No one said a word. The man sat there and adjusted the ash-colored belt around his waist, then spoke to Brant in the same quiet voice that had made him release his grip at the beginning of the evening. He said the young man hadn't been laughing at him. He had been laughing at the thing that frightened him, and the man knew this because someone had once said those exact words to him a very long time ago. Then he turned his wheels. He didn't look at Hollis, or at the students standing frozen around the edge of the mat. He looked toward the hallway, where the woman in the janitor's coat had remained in the same place all this time. He thanked her for the second time that evening, then asked her name. She told him her name was Tessa. The man in the wheelchair said nothing more. His hands went still upon the wheel rims. Something had suddenly drained from his face, and for one brief moment, the man who had just silenced that entire room looked like a man who had heard himself being called by someone long dead. Bruno Sacco didn't ask a single question during the entire drive home. He drove through the harbor district, past rows of darkened warehouses and tall floodlights casting their glow across the wet pavement, and he looked into the rearview mirror only once, when he saw the man in the back seat raise a hand to his chin and remain in that same position for the rest of the journey. By the time the car turned onto the slope leading to the house above the bay, it was nearly midnight, and the lights were still on in the living room. Bruno quietly said that he had been there since the afternoon. Gideon Marchetti nodded, and that was the only exchange between the two men throughout the entire drive. August Marchetti was sitting in the armchair beside the fireplace, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a glass of wine more than half empty on the low table, and beside it lay something else, a thick stack of papers secured inside a leather folder. Augie was a few years older than his cousin, taller and heavier through the body, and the way he sat in another man's house always made people feel as though the house truly belonged to him. He didn't rise when Gideon entered. He merely looked at the clock and asked where Gideon had gone after leaving in the middle of dinner, and without waiting for an answer, he went on to say that everyone at the table had sat there waiting for him, that Uncle Sal had driven all the way down from the North Shore, and that when Gideon left without saying a word, people didn't know what they were supposed to think. Gideon wheeled himself over to the fireplace and stopped beside it. He said he'd had something to take care of. Augie gave a short laugh through his nose, then began recounting the dinner in the tone of a man describing some trivial matter, although every detail he chose to mention was laid down with great care. He said Uncle Sal had brought up the loading contracts at Pier 4, and Augie had answered on Gideon's behalf. He said 2 men from the Ironworkers Union had come asking about the matter on Waverly Street, and they had asked Augie first, so he had taken care of it, all of it, and Gideon didn't need to concern himself. He said it wasn't until dinner was nearly over that anyone had finally turned to ask for Gideon's opinion, but Gideon hadn't been there. Then Augie lifted his wine glass, turned it slowly in his hand, and added that, incidentally, the family dining table had been rearranged. The chair at the head had been removed, so there would be room for Gideon to wheel himself in more easily. They had arranged it among themselves several weeks earlier without needing to ask anyone, because everyone agreed that it made sense. He said it as though he were describing an act of kindness. Gideon Marchetti stared into the flames and remained silent for a long time. He knew that dining table well. He had occupied the head of it since he was 29 years old, when his father died, and the entire family turned to look at him through a silence as heavy as lead. He also knew that when a chair was removed to make room for someone, the person being accommodated was no longer sitting at the head of the table, no matter how kindly everyone spoke about it. He asked Augie what the papers on the table were. Augie set down his wineglass and pushed the stack toward him, and his voice shifted into the warm, reassuring tone he always used when he was about to take something away from someone else. He said this was what Gideon wanted. Gideon had said he wanted out, and this was how he could get out. 3 transportation companies, his interests in 2 waterfront terminals, and several construction permits. Once he signed everything, he'd be free and clear within 6 months, with no ties left to any of it. He could go wherever he wanted, and return wherever he pleased. Gideon slowly turned through the pages one by one. Augie was right about what he wanted. He had wanted it for a long time. Ever since the night he woke in the hospital and realized that he had reached the end of the same road his father had once traveled. For more than a year, he had quietly been untangling one connection at a time, selling one thing, transferring another, finding ways to let everything pass out of his hands without anyone having to bleed. But when he reached the final pages, he stopped. He asked what would happen to the real estate holdings and where the companies that owned the old buildings were listed. Augie waved the question aside and said they could deal with those scraps later. The documents were ancient, left over from another age, and no one could be bothered to touch them. He rose, put on his coat, gave his cousin a gentle pat on the shoulder, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back and told Gideon to remember to arrive early the following Sunday. Then he smiled and closed the door behind him. Gideon Marchetti sat alone in the living room until the last of the wood in the fireplace had burned to ash. He wasn't thinking about the stack of papers. He was thinking about a name that had been spoken in a training room several hours earlier, a name he should have had no reason to remember, and yet it had been echoing steadily inside his mind ever since, refusing to release him. The following morning, Bruno Sacco arrived earlier than usual to pick him up, and they passed through Federal Hill on their way down to the harbor. Bruno always avoided that street. He could take a detour of 3 blocks without needing to be told, and for all those years he had always done exactly that. Until that morning, when the man in the back seat spoke and told him to keep going straight. Bruno looked into the rearview mirror, said nothing, and continued straight ahead. The car moved slowly past the silent row of closed restaurants, past the red brick sidewalk in front of a restaurant that had since changed both its name and the color of its paint, and Gideon Marchetti stared out the window the entire way. Then he opened his wallet. In the innermost compartment, behind several cards he never used, was a small piece of cloth with frayed edges, a torn fragment of a Providence Fire Department shoulder patch, ripped along the seam, and so old that the embroidered thread had nearly lost all its color. He held it in the palm of his hand and said nothing for a while. He remembered the cold pavement. That was what he remembered most clearly. The cold of those red bricks seeping through the back of his shirt and deep into his spine, and the strange thought that had come to him then, that the pavement could be so cold at that time of year. He remembered the headlights of a car parked sideways across the street, so bright that he had to narrow his eyes, and then a figure kneeling down to shield him from that blinding light. The man had possessed a strangely calm voice, the kind of calm belonging to someone who had done this so many times that he no longer felt afraid, and he never stopped talking. He wouldn't allow Gideon to close his eyes for even a second. Every time Gideon felt everything beginning to drift away, another question pulled him back, and every question was harmless. Things like whether he had a wife, where he had been born, and whether he liked fish. Then the man began talking about his own wife because, as he put it, if Gideon refused to speak, then he would do the talking, as long as Gideon could still hear him. He said his wife was studying nursing and was almost finished, with only 1 year left. He said she studied until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, that she had a habit of tapping the end of her pen against the table while she read, which kept him from sleeping, and that she was the most stubborn woman he had ever met in his life. He said her name many times, with the natural ease of someone naming a thing that remained right beside him. He never once gave his own name, and the cruelest irony was that Gideon Marchetti had never asked. By the time Gideon woke in the hospital, 4 months had passed, and the only thing left from that night was the torn piece of cloth found in his coat pocket, something no one could explain how it had gotten there. He had searched for the man. He sent people to the fire department, politely and through the proper channels, asking only who had been present at that street corner that night so that he could offer his thanks. They refused. They refused once, then a second time, and on the third occasion, the man receiving Gideon's representative looked him directly in the eyes and said that they knew who Gideon Marchetti was, and they wouldn't give him the name of anyone of their own. Bruno Sacco had said there were other ways, that he could obtain the duty roster from that night within half a day, without anyone's permission. Gideon himself had stopped him. He had stopped him because he understood something that he would continue to believe was right for years afterward. That if he forced that name into the open, it would end up in someone's ledger, and once it entered a ledger, it would never come out again. The man would be questioned, watched, and linked to the Marchetti name in the records of people with whom he had nothing to do. His entire career could be ruined simply because one night he had knelt on cold pavement and refused to let a stranger close his eyes. So Gideon had stopped searching. He put the scrap of cloth in his wallet and had carried it with him ever since, telling himself that he would never know who the man had been. The car left Federal Hill behind and merged into the morning traffic moving toward the harbor. Gideon Marchetti closed his wallet, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, and told Bruno that he wanted to return to the training room that afternoon. That same morning, several miles from the bay, Tessa Marlowe returned to her room above a laundromat on Cranston Street. She arrived after daylight had already broken and climbed the iron staircase in the back. The staircase that was always warm from the steam rising out of the dryers below. 3 more envelopes lay on the floor just inside the door. She didn't open them. She picked them up, placed them on top of the stack of mail already covering the table, and the stack had grown so tall that she had to brace it with a cup to keep it from falling over. Some of the envelopes she had opened. Others she had stopped opening a long time ago because the number inside was always the same, a number she knew so well that she could recite it without looking. She sat on the edge of the bed, removed her soft-soled shoes, and reached for the shoebox on top of the wardrobe. There was nothing valuable inside. An employee identification card, a wristwatch with a dead battery, several photographs, and a receipt folded into quarters that she still kept even though it served no purpose. Danny Marlowe was a firefighter, and his duty schedule gave him stretches of time off that most people would have used to catch up on sleep. He didn't use them for sleep. He took a second job performing safety inspections for a construction contractor, measuring and recording things at work sites on the western side of the city, and he had accepted that job because Tessa had exactly 1 year left before completing her nursing degree, and they were still short of the money needed for her final year of tuition. She had told him not to do it. She said she could defer a semester, take on more work, and finish school more slowly, and no one would die because of it. He laughed and said no one deferred school during the final year, and all he did was take measurements and write things down, so it wasn't as though he were doing any heavy labor. Then, on a Friday afternoon, she was sitting in the school library when her phone vibrated, and a woman whose voice she had never heard before asked whether she was Mr. Marlowe's wife. She remembered the hospital corridor that day. She remembered its smell, the white lights running along the ceiling, and how long she had sat motionless in that blue plastic chair. She couldn't remember anything anyone had said to her that day. What followed happened much more slowly, because Danny hadn't been working a fire department shift that day, but an extra shift for the contractor. None of the fire department protections applied. Then the contractor submitted its report, and somewhere in that report was a single line stating that Danny hadn't been listed as an official employee at the construction site that day. The insurance company sent a denial letter, brief, courteous, and pre-printed. They denied the claim outright. They put their denial in writing, and Tessa had kept that letter. After that came one winter after another. She left school during the 3rd week of her final semester. She signed the deferment papers without reading them, then went home and became the caregiver for the man who lay there because he had gone out to earn the money that would allow her to learn how to care for other people. She learned how to turn him over, how to read the numbers on the machines, and the name and schedule of every medication. She learned all the things she should have been learning at school, except she learned them alone in her own living room at 2 o'clock in the morning. People told her she was good at it. Nothing made her angrier than hearing people tell her she was good at it. Then one night, after finishing a double shift at her second job and coming home to sit in the chair beside his bed, she fell asleep. She didn't know how long she had slept. She only remembered that when she opened her eyes, the room had become quiet in a completely different way. A kind of silence she recognized immediately, even though she had never heard it before. That was the part she never told anyone. It wasn't the money, the house she'd been forced to sell, or the nights she spent cleaning. It was that on his final night, he had gone alone while she slept right beside him. Tessa closed the lid of the box, returned it to its place on top of the wardrobe, then drew the curtains and lay down, even though the morning outside had already grown bright. They arrived at nearly 7 o'clock in the evening, during the busiest part of the day, and Tessa understood immediately that they hadn't chosen that hour by accident. Two men in tucked dress shirts, one carrying a briefcase, stood directly in the middle of the entrance where everyone coming or going had to walk around them. The man with the briefcase called out her name. He called her by her full name, pronouncing every word clearly, then repeated it once more as though he were afraid there might still be someone in the room who hadn't heard him. The sound of weights in the corner stopped. Several people warming up on the mat raised their heads. Westcroft was standing near the door with a water bottle still in his hand, and he looked at her before quickly turning his eyes away. Tessa set down the mop. She walked toward them, and she walked straight ahead without going around anyone. The man with the briefcase began to read. He read the name of the hospital and the date, and just as he was about to read the amount, Tessa spoke. She asked whether he had brought written verification of the debt. The man faltered. She continued in an even voice, no louder than necessary, saying that she had never received written verification from their company, that she had the right to request it and they were legally required to provide it, and that until they did, they weren't permitted to take any action to collect the debt. The other man opened his mouth to speak, but she raised a hand to stop him and added that she had sent a letter demanding that they cease contacting her at her place of employment. She had sent it by certified mail, she had a receipt, and she had kept that receipt. She told them this was her workplace. Then she looked slowly around the room at every person standing still and listening, and she said the two of them had just violated federal law in front of all those witnesses, and every one of them had heard the men call out her name. No one in the room moved. The man carrying the briefcase reached up to adjust his collar and began saying that they were only following the file they had been assigned and that she should contact their office. But he never finished the sentence. While he was speaking, the sound of wheels rolling across the vinyl floor came from behind him, and the colleague beside him suddenly fell silent. The second man wasn't looking at Tessa. He stared at the place where the wheelchair had just stopped, then looked down at the floor, then looked again, and his face turned as white as paper. He gave the briefcase carrier a small tug at the elbow. The man with the briefcase turned around, and the strap in his hand slipped several inches before he managed to catch it again. Gideon Marchetti didn't say a single word. He merely stopped there with both hands resting on the wheel rims and looked at the two men. Nothing more. The man with the briefcase stammered something about sending the documents through the mail. Then both of them hurried toward the door so quickly that the man behind nearly tripped over the threshold. The glass door closed behind them. Inside the room, the sounds of weights and labored breathing slowly began again, but everyone was deliberately avoiding looking toward the entrance. Tessa returned to where she had left the mop. Her hands were still trembling, just as they had trembled that Tuesday night, but this time she let them shake. Gideon followed her as far as the beginning of the hallway. He said he could take care of it, and he spoke with the manner of a man stating an obvious fact, not one bestowing a favor. He said that whatever the amount might be, it wasn't a figure worth discussing to him, and he could make it disappear before the week was over. Tessa shook her head. He continued, saying she wouldn't owe him anything, and that this wasn't an exchange. She shook her head again, but this time she turned fully around to face him. She said she understood, but he didn't. She said she had stepped onto the mat that night because what she saw happening was wrong, and for no other reason, and that if he paid the debt now, everyone in that room, including Tessa herself, would begin to think that perhaps she had stepped forward because she wanted something in return. She said there weren't many things left that belonged to her, but she still had that, and she wouldn't exchange it for money. Gideon Marchetti looked at her for a long time, then he nodded and didn't say another word. He didn't insist, didn't ask again, and didn't tell her to take more time to think about it. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his coat, took out a business card, placed it on the bench beside where she stood, then turned his wheels and left. The card was ivory-colored, with no name, no title, and no address. There was only a string of numbers printed in black ink, and nothing more. She didn't call the number. She didn't throw the business card away either. She left it in the pocket of her work coat and kept it there. But the training room closed at 10 o'clock. Her cleaning shift lasted until dawn, and he rented the mat beginning at 11 o'clock at night, so there was no avoiding the fact that they would be in the same place. On the first night after that, neither of them said a word to the other. She pushed the mop along the row of lockers, while he trained alone in the middle of the mat, beneath lights that had been dimmed by half. She glanced over several times, then stopped looking because there was nothing remarkable to see in the way he trained. It was only a man repeating the same sequence of movements, slowly and steadily, time after time, until the back of his shirt grew dark with sweat. The second night was the same. On the third night, He stopped, braced himself with one hand, sat upright, and asked her for a glass of water. She filled one for him from the water dispenser mounted on the wall, and when she handed it to him, he asked whether the dispenser broke often. She replied that it broke constantly, that every week she had to strike the latch on its side, and that was how they began talking. They talked until nearly dawn. They didn't discuss anything important. She told him that the smell of bleach in the locker room never went away, no matter what she did. He told her that when he was a boy, he had trained in a church basement where there was no heat during the winter, and the instructor made the children clean the floor before they were allowed to step onto the mat. She asked whether the instructor was still alive, and he said no. Then he asked how long she had worked there, and she answered that it had been a few winters, phrasing it that way without giving him a number. The following night, after Hollis Mackey had gone home, Tessa opened the small cabinet in the corner of the break room. On top of the cabinet, at its highest point, Hollis kept a container of good coffee reserved for guests. She stood looking at it for a moment, then pulled over a chair, took the coffee down, and placed it in the bottom compartment, the lowest one, level with someone who was seated. She did it quickly, then went back outside to continue mopping the floor without saying anything to anyone. He noticed it that very night. She knew he had noticed because she heard his wheels stop in front of the cabinet for longer than necessary. But he didn't thank her. He didn't come out and say a word about it, and he didn't smile in the way people often smiled when someone took pity on them, because if he said even a single word of thanks, what she had just done would instantly become an act of pity. And both of them understood that. He simply made 2 cups. He left one on the edge of the table for himself and carried the other out, setting it at the edge of the mat where she often sat to rest after mopping half the room. From that night forward, there were 2 cups of coffee every night. One night, near the end of the month, while they sat several paces apart, she told him about the storage unit. She spoke as though she were recounting some trivial matter, her voice ordinary as she turned the cup slowly in her hands. She said her belongings were kept in a rented storage unit on 2nd Street. There was nothing valuable inside, just several boxes of books and some clothes. But her husband's helmet was there. She said the words her husband with perfect calm, and continued speaking without pausing over them. She said it was a firefighter's helmet, an old one with a badly worn brim, and she had once intended to leave it to someone at the department, but had changed her mind. Then she said she had been a week late paying the storage fee the previous month, and she gave a short laugh, adding that she would probably have a hard time finding enough money to cover it the following month as well. When she finished, she drank the last of her coffee, stood, and went to retrieve the mop. She hadn't looked at him while telling the story. She hadn't asked for anything, hadn't shed a single tear, and hadn't imagined that she had revealed anything important. Gideon Marchetti remained motionless at the edge of the mat for a long time after she disappeared into the hallway. He said nothing. He made no promises. Brant Kessler never returned to teach. During the first week, Hollis Mackey told everyone that Brant had suffered a minor injury. During the second week, he said nothing at all, and simply posted a notice on the bulletin board stating that someone else would be taking over the Tuesday night class. The students whispered about it for a while and then stopped, because in a training room, it wasn't unusual for someone to disappear. But Wes Croft paid attention. He paid attention because every night when he walked out to the parking lot, he saw the same gray pickup parked in the far corner beneath a lamppost with a burned-out bulb, and someone was always sitting inside. On the 4th night, Wes carried his water bottle over to the truck and knocked on the window. Brant lowered it. He didn't get out, didn't turn off the music, and didn't even turn his face fully toward Wes. Wes asked whether he was planning to come inside, and Brant said no. Wes stood there for a while, then asked whether he was all right, and Brant gave a short laugh through his nose, a laugh with no trace of amusement in it. A phone lay face down on the passenger seat. Wes noticed it because Brant kept reaching over to turn it face up, and then face down again, face up, and then face down, repeating the motion as though it had become a nervous habit. Then Brant Kessler began to speak, and the 19-year-old student standing outside the truck wasn't prepared for what he was about to hear. Brant said he had an older brother named Colin. He spoke the name and then paused for a long time, as though even he hadn't said it aloud in years. He explained that 3 winters earlier, the 2 brothers had been driving home from a tournament in the northern part of the state. Brant had been behind the wheel, and he lost control of the truck. Wes blurted out a question, asking whether Brant had been drinking, and for the first time during the entire conversation, Brant turned his face fully toward him. He said no. He said that was the point. He said that if he had been drinking, at least he would have had something to blame. something outside himself that he could point to and say it had been responsible. But he hadn't consumed a single drop. He had only looked down at his phone. The group stage draw had just been posted, and he wanted to know which bracket he had been placed in. That was all. He looked down at the screen for only a few seconds, and when he raised his eyes again, everything had changed. Wes couldn't find anything to say. Brant continued, explaining that Colin now used a wheelchair and lived with their mother on the other side of the state, about 2 hours away by car. Then he told Wes the part he had never told anyone. He said that when the police arrived, Colin had been the one who gave the statement. Colin told them the vehicle had lost control because of the road conditions. He gave the statement clearly and repeated the same account over and over until it was entered into the official report. No one was prosecuted. There was no trial, no sentence, and not a single line in any record stating that a man had looked down at his phone screen that night. His older brother had protected him, and he had done it on the very night he lost the use of his legs. Wes asked whether Brant visited him often. Brant Kessler remained silent for a long time. Then he said that for more than a full winter afterward, he hadn't entered his brother's room even once. He had driven there. He had parked on the street and sat inside the truck, staring up at the first-floor window, sometimes remaining there for 1 or 2 hours before turning the truck around and driving home. He said he hadn't dared to go inside, because the moment he saw his brother sitting in that chair, he would have to admit that the chair existed because of him. And Wes Croft, standing beneath the dead lamppost in the Iron Harbor parking lot, suddenly understood what had truly happened that Tuesday night. The man sitting inside that truck had never despised the wheelchair at all. He had grabbed the collar of the man sitting in it because he couldn't bear to look into a mirror. The notice was posted on her door one Thursday morning. The building manager said the new owner from the property management company wanted to clear out the old leases so the entire upper floor could be renovated, and he said it in the voice of a man who had repeated the same words to many people that week. He told her she had 10 days. Tessa asked who the new owner was, and he shrugged, saying the papers had been signed somewhere in the office, that he only followed orders, and that he didn't even know the name of the company. She didn't argue. She folded the notice, put it in her pocket, and went to work her night shift as usual. The 10 days passed more quickly than she had expected. She called every place she could think of, and every one of them demanded a deposit in advance. Every one of them demanded something she didn't have. In the end, she loaded the things she needed into the trunk of her old car and left everything else temporarily with different people. That night, she parked in the Iron Harbor parking lot, in the far corner beneath the lamppost with the burned-out bulb, exactly where the gray pickup had once been parked each night. She slept in the driver's seat, reclining it by a single notch and locking the doors, and managed to sleep for several hours. The second night was the same. The third night was the same. Every morning she woke before 5 o'clock, went into the locker room to wash her face and tie back her hair, then walked outside and waited until opening time, as though she had just arrived from home. Hollis Mackey didn't know. Wes Croft didn't know. The man who sat at the edge of the mat every night with 2 cups of coffee didn't know either, because she had calculated the timing carefully enough to ensure that he would never see her car parked there when he left. She didn't tell anyone a word, and she didn't consider it worth mentioning because, in her mind, this was only temporary, something that would last for a few weeks, and as long as she didn't let anyone find out, it would pass. What she hadn't accounted for was the money. There was the deposit she had paid on a new place only to have it canceled at the last minute, the money for gasoline now that she had to drive all over the city, and the expenses she suddenly had to pay all at once, instead of spreading them out as she had before. By the time she remembered the storage unit on 2nd Street, the payment was already 2 weeks overdue. She drove there on a Saturday afternoon. The young man working in the office entered her account number into the computer, looked at the screen, then looked at her, and his expression changed before he managed to speak. He told her the rental agreement had been terminated. He said their policy required them to mail a notice to the registered address, and Tessa stood there thinking about the gap beneath the door of the room above the laundromat, thinking of the envelopes falling onto the floor of a place where she no longer lived. He told her the contents of the unit had been liquidated the previous weekend. He spoke the word liquidated very gently, apologized to her twice, and had no idea what he had just told her. She asked whether there was a list of buyers. He shook his head and explained that someone had paid cash and hauled away the entire lot, and no record had been kept. Tessa walked down the long concrete corridor toward the back, where the afternoon sunlight entered in narrow bands through the gaps around the storage doors. She found her unit. Its metal door had been raised all the way, A new lock was already hanging at the side, and the space inside was utterly empty and swept clean. Only a few outlines remained in the dust on the concrete floor, marking the shapes of the boxes that had once stood there. She remained in front of that empty unit for a long time. She didn't cry. She simply stood there with one hand resting against the doorframe, staring into the vacant space, and there was nothing in her mind except one painfully clear image: the worn brim of the helmet, the paint peeling across its front, the only thing left in the world that had once rested on Danny Marlowe's head. The following Monday evening, rain had been falling since the afternoon, and in a back room behind a closed restaurant down by the harbor, a man sat across from Gideon Marchetti and spoke for nearly half an hour. His name was Ray Petrosino, and he worked for the Dockworkers Union. 3 sheets of paper lay on the table between them. Ray didn't ask what they were. He began talking the moment he sat down, speaking about the pension fund, about the way certain contributions had been routed through another account before being returned, and about how he had only intended to borrow the money temporarily and then pay it back. Then he began talking about his wife. He said she had been ill since the spring. He named the hospital, described the treatments that their insurance covered only in part, and said that every night he sat outside in the corridor and waited until morning. He spoke with both hands resting on his thighs and his head slightly bowed, and somewhere in the middle, his voice broke. Gideon Marchetti listened to everything. He didn't interrupt the man for even a second. He didn't look at his watch, didn't signal to anyone, and didn't show the slightest impatience. He allowed Ray to speak until the final sentence, until the man had nothing left to say, and the only sound in the room was rain striking the sheet metal roof in the back. Then Gideon said he was deeply sorry about Ray's wife. He meant it. It wasn't a polite formality, and anyone listening could tell that it was sincere. After that, he pushed the 3 sheets of paper toward Ray Petrosino and told him he had 72 hours. Ray raised his eyes to look at him. He waited for something more. Another sentence, some opening, anything at all. But nothing came. Gideon turned his wheels and headed for the door, and he didn't speak again until Bruno Sacco opened the car door for him. Once inside, he stared through the curtain of rain and told Bruno to stop by Iron Harbor. Bruno glanced into the rearview mirror and said it wasn't even 11 o'clock yet, and Gideon replied that they should stop there anyway. As the car moved through the rain, Bruno mentioned that Augie had called twice that afternoon to ask when Gideon would finish signing those papers, but Gideon didn't respond. Only 2 cars remained in the Iron Harbor parking lot. Rain slanted through the floodlights, and in the far corner beneath the lamppost with the burned-out bulb, 3 people were standing. Tessa Marlowe stood with her back against the door of her car. 2 men in raincoats faced her, one blocking the space directly in front of her and the other standing slightly to her right, and neither man was holding anything. The man in front was speaking. In a perfectly ordinary voice, almost a friendly one, he said someone wanted him to deliver a message to her. He said they knew she worked the night shift there, knew she often parked in that corner, and even knew that lately she hadn't been going home. Tessa didn't retreat. She stood straight, with her chin slightly raised and her shoulders squared, her right hand inside her coat pocket, her fingers arranging her keys so that the tip of one key protruded between her knuckles. She had been standing that way before they finished their first sentence. She asked whether they had anything else to say, using the same even voice she had used when the 2 debt collectors entered the training room. The man hesitated slightly. He was about to continue when the sound of wheels grinding across the wet pavement came from behind him. Gideon Marchetti rolled toward them alone. Bruno wasn't with him. No one else was there. There was only Gideon, bareheaded beneath the rain, both hands driving the wheels through the puddles. He stopped several paces away. He didn't ask who they were. He looked at the man standing in front of Tessa and spoke the name of his probation officer, then stated the date when he was required to report each month. Then he turned toward the other man and recited the license plate number of the car he was driving. He said the car was registered in his sister's name, then named the repair shop on Allen's Avenue, where the man had taken it to have the front bumper repaired the previous month. He spoke slowly and distinctly, in the voice of someone reading from a list. There wasn't a single threat in his words. Not one sentence told them what they should or shouldn't do. The 2 men stood frozen in the rain. Then Gideon added one final sentence. He said he never threatened anyone, because threats were the work of men who were incapable of action. He said he was merely letting them know that he knew. The man in front swallowed hard and nodded mechanically. Then both men turned away and walked quickly toward the far end of the parking lot. 2 car doors slammed through the rain. Tessa remained exactly where she was. She drew her hand out of her coat pocket, and the keys clutched in her palm had left deep red impressions in her skin. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He only said they should go inside in weather like this. And he let her in with his own key, switched on exactly 2 rows of lights above the mat, and left the rest of the room submerged in darkness. There was no one else anywhere in the building. Tessa sat at the edge of the mat with her hair still wet and both hands resting on her knees, waiting for him to say the thing she felt he had wanted to tell her for a very long time. He took his wallet from the inside pocket of his coat. He opened the final compartment, removed something, held it in his palm for a moment, then extended it toward her. It was a small scrap of fabric, torn along the seam, its edges completely frayed, and the embroidered thread had faded so badly that she had to tilt it toward the light to make out what it said. Tessa took it. She looked at it, and he watched her fingers close around the fabric very slowly, the way someone held something they had believed no longer existed anywhere in the world. She recognized it immediately. She had repaired that seam 3 times with her own hands. Then Gideon Marchetti began to tell her. He said that a very long time ago, on a street corner in Federal Hill, he had been lying on red brick pavement, and what he remembered most clearly was the cold seeping through the back of his shirt and deep into his bones. He told her that the headlights of a car parked sideways across the street had been shining directly into his eyes, and then someone had knelt down between him and that light. He said the man had possessed a strangely calm voice and wouldn't allow Gideon to close his eyes for even a second. Every time everything began to drift away, another question pulled him back. Questions about nothing in particular, such as where he had been born and whether he liked fish. Then the man said that if Gideon couldn't speak, he would do the talking, as long as Gideon could still hear him, and he began telling Gideon about his wife. He said his wife was studying nursing and was almost finished, with only 1 year remaining. He said she studied until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, that she had a habit of tapping the end of her pen against the table while she read, which kept him from sleeping, and that she was the most stubborn woman he had ever met in his life. At that point, Tessa raised one hand to cover her mouth. Gideon continued, saying that the man had spoken his wife's name many times that night, saying it as naturally as someone naming a thing that was still right beside him, and that he had never once given his own name. Gideon said he woke a long time afterward, and the only thing left was that scrap of fabric in his coat pocket, though no one knew how it had gotten there. He told her he had searched. He sent people to the fire department 3 times, and all 3 requests were refused. On the final occasion, they told his representative directly that they knew who Gideon Marchetti was, and they wouldn't give him the name of anyone of their own. Tessa asked why he hadn't found another way. Gideon was silent for a moment, then said he'd had another way. He said his people could have obtained the duty roster from that night within half a day without anyone's permission, and he had stopped them. He stopped them because he knew that once the name was forced into the open, it would enter someone's ledger, and names that entered those ledgers never came out again. The man would be questioned, watched, and linked to Gideon's family name in the records of people with whom he had nothing to do. Gideon said he had told himself that he would never know who the man had been, and he had lived with that for all those years. Until that Tuesday night, when he asked the name of a woman who had stepped onto the mat to defend him, and she answered. Tessa remained silent for a long time. Rainwater dripped from her hair onto the mat, leaving several dark marks. Then she said his name had been Danny. She said he had been a firefighter. She said he had died 2 winters ago, and she spoke with the calm voice that only belonged to someone who had practiced saying those words many times. Gideon Marchetti lowered his head. He remained that way for a while, then thanked her. She asked what he was thanking her for, and he replied that it was because she had stepped onto the mat that night, just as her husband had knelt on the pavement that other night, and he said he didn't believe it was a coincidence. Outside, the rain had begun to ease. Tessa held the scrap of fabric out to him, but he shook his head and closed her hand around it. That night, for the first time in a very long while, both of them felt a little lighter. The woman waited for her one morning at the diner across from the training room, just after Tessa had finished her night shift, and was waiting for the cheapest cup of coffee on the menu. She wore a gray coat, her hair was cut short, and she placed her card on the table with the practiced motion of someone who had done it so many times that no accompanying words were necessary. She introduced herself as Delia Voss, an assistant United States attorney. She didn't ask how Tessa was feeling, didn't apologize for disturbing her, and didn't waste time circling the subject. She asked whether Tessa knew who truly owned the warehouse on Waverly Street. Tessa said she didn't know, that there had only been the name of some company on the paperwork at the time, and that the name had meant nothing to her. Delia Voss nodded as though she had expected that answer. Then she said she was building a case, that the case had been sitting on her desk for many years, and that one part of it concerned the roof that had collapsed on Tessa's husband. She said what she lacked wasn't documentation. She had more than enough paperwork. What she lacked was a living person willing to sit in the witness chair and speak the name of the man who had been beneath that roof. Tessa asked what would happen if she refused. Delia Voss was silent for a moment, then answered with complete honesty. She said that in 3 weeks, the deadline for her to act on that part of the case would expire, and after that, it would be closed forever. No one would be able to reopen it, not even her. She said the only official account of what had happened on Waverly Street would then be the report submitted by the contractor. And in that report, Tessa's husband was described as a man who had entered a restricted area without authorization, whose name wasn't on the list of workers, and for whom no one bore responsibility. She said that if those 3 weeks passed without anyone speaking, that would be the only thing the records of the state would ever say about him. Then she placed a business card on the table, stood, and left. She didn't offer Tessa anything. Tessa remained alone with her cold coffee. 2 days later, someone called her phone, and the courteous voice of an older man invited her to lunch. The restaurant was in Federal Hill, with white tablecloths, and even at midday, the dining room was dark and warm. Emmett Sarno rose when she entered. He personally pulled out her chair, asked whether she was cold, told the server to bring more warm water, then ordered for both of them without showing her the menu, speaking with the ease of a man who ate there every day. He asked how well she had been sleeping and whether the night work was difficult. He didn't mention the woman in the gray coat. He didn't mention that Tuesday night in the training room. He didn't speak the name Marchetti once throughout the meal. It wasn't until the server had cleared away their plates that he lifted a thin file folder from beneath his chair, placed it on the table before her, turned it so that it faced the right direction, then leaned back and said nothing more. Tessa opened it. The first page was the ownership registration for the company holding the title to the Waverly Street warehouse. Beneath it was another document showing who owned that company, followed by another document, and then another, one after the next, until every thread led back to the same family name. The next page was an estimate for reinforcing the roof. One line had been crossed out in red ink, with an old figure and a new one beside it, and a handwritten note in the margin stating that the roof structure had been adjusted to meet the budget. On the final page, in the lower right corner of the approval form, there was a signature. The handwriting slanted, written quickly, with a slight tremor at the end. Tessa stared at it for a long time. She knew that signature. She had seen it several times on papers in the training room, and she had once thought it looked like the handwriting of someone in a hurry. Emmett Sarno reached over and turned the page to the back for her, pointed to the faintly printed date in the corner, then spoke the only words he said about the matter during the entire meal. He said Gideon had signed those papers during the very week he was released from the hospital. After that, he folded his napkin, placed it on the table, and told her she could keep the file because he had another copy. Then he thanked her for coming, wished her a pleasant afternoon, and walked out through the front door, leaving her alone in the warm dining room with its white tablecloths, the documents lying open before her, and the name of a man she had learned to trust resting directly beneath her fingertips. She arrived at the training room at 11 o'clock that night, but she wasn't carrying a mop. She walked straight across the mat to where he sat in the middle of the room beneath the 2 familiar rows of lights, and she placed the file in front of him. Gideon Marchetti looked down. He didn't ask where she had gotten it. He turned through the pages one at a time, slowly, while Tessa stood there watching his face. She had prepared herself for him to say the documents were false, that someone had fabricated the story, that she had been deceived. She had even prepared herself for an explanation, for some long account of the tangled network of companies he couldn't possibly have controlled completely. But he did none of those things. He reached the final page, stared at his own signature for a long time, then raised his eyes and said it was his signature. That was all, not another word. Tessa asked whether he had known. He said he hadn't. She asked what he had signed. He said he hadn't read it. He said that during the week after he came out of the hospital, someone had brought him a stack of papers, placed them on his lap, and told him the signatures were urgently needed. He had signed every one of them, page after page, without reading a single line, because he still couldn't sit upright without assistance, and wanted only for someone to take the stack away where he wouldn't have to see it. He said all of this without once raising his voice in his own defense. He didn't say he had been exploited. He didn't speak anyone else's name. Then he paused and added that none of it changed anything. And when he said those words, his voice sounded like that of a man reading his own sentence. Tessa remained motionless for a long time. She looked at the man who had sat at the edge of that mat with 2 cups of coffee for so many nights, the man who had carried a torn scrap of fabric in his wallet for so many years because he hadn't wanted to ruin the life of a stranger. Then she heard her own voice, and its calmness frightened her. She said he had kept that piece of the shoulder patch all those years so he wouldn't destroy Danny's life, when he had already destroyed it, except he had done it with a pen. When she finished, she picked up the file and walked out. She didn't slam the door. There was no sound of wheels following behind her. The following night, in the living room above the bay, Bruno Sacco stood before him and placed the car keys on the low table. Bruno said he had been the one who cut the funding for the roof reinforcement. He said Gideon had been in the hospital at the time. Cash had been scarce. Several urgent payments had been due, and Bruno had made cuts wherever he believed they could be made. He said he had remained silent about it ever since. Then he stepped back and waited, both arms hanging at his sides, his eyes never straying elsewhere. Gideon Marchetti picked up the estimate. He looked at the old figure crossed out, and the new figure written over it. He studied it for a while, then set the paper down and said that in all the years Bruno had worked for him, his approval limit had never been high enough to authorize an amount like this. He said only 2 people in the family had possessed the authority to sign off on such a figure while he was in the hospital, and one of those people had been breathing through a machine. The room fell silent. Gideon asked Bruno whom he was protecting. Bruno Sacco didn't answer. He didn't argue, didn't deny it, and didn't say another word. He merely stood there staring at the floor, and the silence lasted long enough to become the clearest answer he had ever given in his life. Gideon looked at him. He had known this man since Bruno drove for his father. He knew Bruno could stand outside a glass door for 2 hours in the rain without uttering a single complaint, and he understood that this silence wasn't meant to save Bruno himself. He pushed the keys back toward him. He didn't shout. He didn't dismiss him. He didn't ask another question to force him to speak the name. He only said that the signature on the final page was his signature, and that regardless of who had held the pen that cut the figure, the name at the bottom was still his name, and no one in this world could carry that burden for him. Then he turned his wheels, looked through the window toward the black waters of the bay, and told Bruno to go home. She needed a copy of the medical records. If she was going to sit in the witness chair, they would ask her about those final days, and she wanted to hold exactly what had been recorded in her hands instead of relying on her memory. So on Wednesday morning, she went to the hospital, stood in line at the records office, filled out the form, then sat waiting on the row of plastic chairs in the corridor. She hadn't set foot inside that building for 2 winters. It still smelled exactly the same. A woman walked past her, then stopped. She wore blue nursing scrubs. There was more gray in her hair now, and she looked at Tessa for a moment before calling her name. It took Tessa a while to remember her. Her name was Marguerite. She had been the nurse working the night shift on that floor back then. She asked how Tessa was doing, and Tessa said she was fine. Then Marguerite sat down in the chair beside her. She said she still thought about the 2 of them often. Tessa nodded. She was about to offer some polite remark and let the conversation pass, but then she stopped herself. Marguerite remained quiet for a moment. Then she said there was something she had wanted to tell Tessa for a long time. She said that on that final night, at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, she had entered the room to check on them. Tessa was asleep in the chair beside the bed. She said Tessa's husband was still awake. He looked toward Tessa, then shifted his eyes toward the light switch on the wall. Marguerite asked whether he needed anything. He asked her to turn down the lights. She told him she should wake Tessa so that she would know, and he told her not to. Marguerite paused. She looked down at her hands resting in her lap. Then she continued. She said Danny had told her that his wife hadn't slept through an entire night in a very long time. He said she turned him throughout the night, woke according to his medication schedule, and still went to work during the day. He said she was sleeping, and they should let her sleep. Marguerite said she asked him once more. She asked whether he was certain, and he said yes. She said she had switched off the 2 rows of lights above the bed and left only the small lamp in the corner of the room. She said he had also asked her to take the thin blanket from the foot of the bed and cover Tessa with it, and she had done so. She said he lay with his face turned toward the chair. Then she left the room and quietly closed the door. Marguerite said that was the last time she ever spoke with him. Tessa sat motionless. Someone pushed a cart through the corridor, its wheels rattling against the tile floor, and the sound gradually faded into the distance. Marguerite said she had intended to tell Tessa that same day. But Tessa had been standing in the corridor, unable to speak to anyone, so she hadn't told her. Then Tessa hadn't returned in the weeks that followed. Marguerite said she was sorry. She said she should have found a way to tell her sooner. Tessa opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. She sat upright in the plastic chair with both hands resting on her knees, staring directly at the wall across from her. Marguerite placed one hand on her arm. She said Tessa hadn't slept through what happened. She said Danny had chosen it that way. She said he had lain there watching Tessa sleep, and had chosen to let her keep sleeping. Then Marguerite stood, because someone was calling her from the far end of the corridor. She gave Tessa's arm a gentle squeeze and walked away. Tessa remained in that chair. Someone in the records office called her name twice, and she didn't hear. When they called a third time, she rose, walked to the counter, signed the receipt, and accepted the file. She made her way to the parking lot. She opened the car door, sat in the driver's seat, and placed the file on the seat beside her. She fastened her seatbelt. Then she collapsed forward against the steering wheel and cried the way a person cries after holding something inside her chest for 2 winters and finally feeling it break open. She cried for a very long time. No one passed by. When she finally raised her head, afternoon had come, and the sunlight slanting through the windshield forced her to lift a hand to shield her eyes. She found it the following night, while sitting in her car with the medical records open across her lap beneath the overhead light. Near the end, in the section listing payments, there was a line showing a date and a payment received, and the name of an insurance company appeared in the notes column. It was the same insurance company that had sent her the pre-printed denial letter back then, the letter she still kept in the shoebox. She read the line 3 times. The date fell sometime in the middle of the previous winter, more than a year after Danny had died. The next morning, she called the hospital's financial office. She had to call 4 times, wait on hold, and be transferred through 3 different people before a woman in the billing department finally agreed to look into it for her. The woman read the same line aloud, then remained silent a little too long. She said the amount had been recorded as a payment from a third party. Tessa asked why she had continued receiving bills all that time if someone had already paid. The woman said she couldn't explain it because the account had already been transferred outside the hospital before the payment arrived. Tessa asked what transferred outside meant. The woman explained, in the voice of someone who knew she was revealing something she probably shouldn't, that when accounts remained overdue for too long, hospitals often sold them to companies specializing in debt collection. They sold them in large batches for a small fraction of the amounts shown on paper. She said that once the accounts had been sold, the hospital considered the matter closed, while the company that bought them continued trying to collect the full original balance, because every dollar it recovered became profit. Tessa asked what happened if someone later paid the hospital. The woman said that payment would simply remain in the hospital's records. Tessa sat motionless in the car for a long time after ending the call. The contractor had arranged for its insurance company to quietly make a payment to the hospital after the matter had faded from attention. A payment designed to ensure that no one would have to determine who had been at fault. The hospital accepted the money, but the account bearing Tessa's name had already been sold, and it had continued living a separate life at another company, inside another system, with the old balance completely unchanged. Throughout those 2 winters, she had worked 3 jobs, sold her house, slept in her car, and stood staring into an empty storage unit, all to pay a debt that no one in the world had any right to demand from her anymore. That afternoon, she took everything to Delia Voss's office. She placed the file Sarno had given her, the medical records, and the old denial letter on the desk. Delia Voss moved through them quickly, then looked up and said this was better than anything she had expected. She said that with these documents, the trial was already halfway won, and all Tessa needed to do was take the witness chair as they had discussed. Tessa said she wouldn't do it. Delia Voss put down her pen. She reminded Tessa that only a little more than a week remained, and that if the deadline passed, Danny Marlowe's name would remain forever in the contractor's report, as a man who had entered a restricted area without authorization. She spoke slowly, 1 word at a time, exactly as she had during their first meeting, and Tessa looked directly at her. She said 2 men had once stood in the middle of the training room where she worked and called her name loudly in front of everyone, and they had done it because they knew exactly where her pain was. She said Delia Voss was doing the same thing, except she was doing it in an air-conditioned office and calling it justice. She said she had once refused a man who wanted to pay all her debts, and she had refused because she wouldn't sell the night she stepped onto the mat. But this was different. This time, she was refusing because if she stood and spoke her husband's name only in exchange for the thing Delia was holding in front of her, she would become exactly the kind of person who had driven her to this point. She said that if Danny's name was going to enter the record, it had to be entered because someone had freely chosen to speak the truth, not because someone had been forced into a corner. During the final week before the deadline, a petition was filed in federal court that no one on Delia Voss's side had anticipated because it didn't come from her office. It came from Gideon Marchetti's private attorney. On the morning of the hearing, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Several reporters occupied the back row. People from local newspapers stood in the corridor, and Delia Voss sat in the front row with a file resting on her lap that she didn't open even once. Bruno Sacco stood at the back of the room against the wall. August Marchetti sat on the right side of the second row, wearing a dark coat, his back straight and his hands clasped together. Before the hearing began, Gideon's attorney leaned close to his ear and slid a typed sheet of paper toward him. The attorney had spent weeks negotiating to obtain it. The page contained a short, carefully worded statement, admitting to a single procedural error and nothing more. If Gideon read it exactly as written, the matter would end quietly, with probation, a fine, and the Marchetti name appearing nowhere except in a few minor lines buried in the archived record. His attorney reminded him that he only needed to read what was written there. When the judge called his name, Gideon Marchetti wheeled himself forward. He held the paper in his hand. He looked at it for a moment, then folded it and placed it on the table. He said the signature on the structural approval for the roof of the Waverly Street property was his signature. He said he had signed it without reading it, and that his failure to read the document didn't make the signature any less his. His attorney turned fully around to stare at him. Gideon continued. He said the company that held the title to the warehouse didn't operate independently, and he stated the name of its parent company, followed by the name of that company's parent company, speaking slowly enough for the court clerk to record each one. He said that during the same period, other properties had been handled in the same manner, and that his attorney would submit the complete list to the court that very morning, together with every original cost estimate for each individual property. Whispers moved through the courtroom. The judge struck the gavel once. Delia Voss sat upright, and for the first time that morning, she opened the file on her lap. In the second row, August Marchetti didn't move, but his clasped hands tightened. Gideon said he was offering to pay personally for the inspection and reinforcement of every property named on the list, beginning immediately without waiting for the court's ruling, and that he had signed the authorization the previous day. He said he wasn't asking for leniency because of it. Then he paused. He asked the court's permission to add one more statement that didn't appear in any document. The judge allowed it. Gideon Marchetti said that the report submitted by the contractor after the roof collapsed described the injured man as someone whose name hadn't appeared on the list of workers and who had entered a restricted area without authorization. He said that wasn't true. He said the man had been there because he was hired to perform a safety inspection, that he had been working a second job outside his regular shift, and that he was a firefighter for the city. Then Gideon spoke his name. He said the man's name was Danny Marlowe. He pronounced the name slowly, each word clear and separate, and asked the court to enter it into the official record of the hearing. The entire room fell silent. The court clerk finished typing the final line and looked up. The judge looked down and asked Gideon to repeat the man's full name for confirmation. And Gideon said it again. At the back of the room, Bruno Sacco raised a hand and wiped his eyes. No one in the courtroom that morning knew that across the city, the woman to whom the name that had just been spoken belonged was mopping the floor of a closed training room, completely unaware of what was happening. Gideon didn't know she wanted this. She had never told him she wanted it. He did it because it was the only right thing he had left to do. And he did it after she had walked away and stopped returning. When the hearing recessed, his attorney gathered his papers without speaking. It wasn't until they reached the corridor that he said Gideon had just thrown away everything the attorney had spent months building. Gideon Marchetti replied that he knew. Everything collapsed even faster than his attorney had warned. 3 loading contracts at the harbor were canceled within a month. 2 unions removed his name from their lists of advisors. The people who had called him every week stopped calling, and at the first Sunday dinner after the hearing, August Marchetti took the seat at the head of the table without anyone saying a word. The final sentence was nearly a year in a federal correctional facility in the western part of the state, along with the restitution Gideon had voluntarily paid before the court even ordered it. He didn't appeal. Before leaving, he signed the remaining transfer documents, every one of them, and this time he read every line. The only thing he retained was the old real estate portfolio, the companies that held title to the buildings Augie had once waved aside and said they could deal with later. Gideon sold everything, and all the proceeds were transferred into a fund established by his attorney. The fund did only one thing. It purchased overdue medical debts from collection companies, buying them in large batches at the pitiful prices those companies traded among themselves, then erased them completely. The number of families in the state who received debt forgiveness letters that winter exceeded the number of seats in an entire arena. It was called the Marlowe Fund, and Gideon Marchetti's name appeared nowhere in any of its founding documents. That same winter, Brant Kessler returned to Iron Harbor early one morning just after the training room opened. He didn't step onto the mat. He found Wes Croft and stood there awkwardly for a long time, before managing to say that he had been wrong on the night he pinned Wes down, and then got up and walked away, and that he had been wrong for a long time, not only on that one night. Wes nodded and said it was all right. Brant shook his head and said it wasn't. Then he drove 2 hours to the other side of the state. He parked on the street as he always did, and sat motionless as he always did. But this time, he got out of the truck. He had knocked on that door twice earlier in the winter, and no one had answered either time. On the third occasion, the door opened. Colin Kessler sat there with his hands resting on the wheel rims, looking at his younger brother. Neither of them spoke for a very long time. Then Colin rolled back slightly, just far enough to leave an opening at the threshold, and Brant stepped inside. As for Tessa, the letter from the fire department arrived in early spring. After the hearing, the records from that night in Federal Hill were unsealed by court order, and among them was a recording from the dispatch radio. She sat in the department's records room wearing headphones, and someone pressed the button for her. There was static, the distant sound of car horns, and then a man's voice, calm and distinct, the same professional voice she had heard him use hundreds of times while speaking over the radio at home. He reported his location, described the injured man's condition, and requested assistance. Then his voice changed, growing softer and closer, as though he were bending down to speak to someone beside him. He told the man to keep looking at him and not to close his eyes. He asked whether the man had a wife. No? Well, he did. He said he would tell the man about her, and that all the man needed to do was keep listening. Then he spoke her name. Tessa listened to the entire recording without removing the headphones once. Near the end of that spring, Tessa Marlowe drove 2.5 hours west to a row of low-gray buildings beyond a wire fence and a broad parking lot. She didn't bring flowers. She waited in the visitation area until they brought him out, and when he wheeled himself through the doorway, he stopped because he hadn't expected her to come. She placed the object she had brought on his lap. It was an old firefighter's helmet, its brim worn, and the paint across the front almost entirely peeled away. Neither of them said anything about where it had come from. Gideon Marchetti placed both hands upon it and lowered his head for a long time. Then Tessa said she didn't forgive him for the roof. She said she had tried, but she couldn't, and perhaps she never would. But she said she was there. She said they could begin with that. Outside, the late spring sunlight poured across the empty parking lot, and the two of them sat facing each other in the visitation room without saying anything more until their time was over. This story leaves us with 3 lessons that perhaps all of us should carry with us. First, true strength never needs to raise its voice, because the strongest person in a room is often the one who sits in the greatest silence. Second, human dignity doesn't reside in the body a person inhabits, nor in whether that person stands or sits, but in what they choose to do when no one is watching. And third, for everyone who has cared or is still caring for someone they love, if you have ever fallen asleep beside a hospital bed and carried that guilt for years, please believe that you didn't abandon anyone. You simply loved until you were exhausted, and you deserve forgiveness, beginning with forgiveness from yourself. If today's story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you believe needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening to meaningful stories together every day. How do you feel about Tessa and Gideon's choice? Please leave a comment below. We sincerely want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. We wish all of you abundant health and days filled with happiness and peace beside the people you love. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.